It was 1885, and the race was on among European nations to carve up the Pacific. Western powers had already claimed most of the islands south of the equator. Now Germany announced its intention to annex the Caroline Islands. Spain, which claimed ancient title to the Carolines by right of discovery, immediately dispatched 2 warships to take possession of the islands. The Spanish ships reached Yap first in late August 1885. But while the Spanish naval party was surveying the island to decide where to locate their capital, a German naval cruiser steamed into the island and within a half an hour hoisted the German flag over Yap. Germany had seemingly won the race for the Carolines. An enraged Spanish populace bitterly contested Germany's claim to the island group. Heated diplomatic notes were exchanged between the 2 countries, and nationalistic feelings ran so strong that the dispute over the Carolines brought Europe to the brink of war. Nationalism was on the rise in Europe during the late 19th century. With it came a voracious appetite for colonial expansion. For the world powers of the 1880s, emerging nations like Germany and those long past their peak like Spain, colonial expansion was a matter of national pride. All truly advanced peoples have founded colonies, as one German professor put it. Colonies are merely the expression of the spirit of enterprise of strong nations. The dispute raged for several months. Then suddenly, Germany yielded its claim to the Carolines and settled back to develop its copra trade in the region, leaving Spain to bear the burden of administering its new colony. Meanwhile, Germany founded colonies of its own. In 1885, Germany formally annexed the Marshall Islands as a protectorate. It administered its new colony under the Jesuit Company, the largest trading firm in the region. The copra trade was big business in the Marshalls during these years, and German trading companies had a major share in the trade. Jesuit, the capital of the Marshalls, was one of the busiest ports in the Pacific. Spanish presence in the Carolines, on the other hand, was not much more than a holding operation. On Pohnpei, the administrative center for the Eastern Carolines, the Spaniards established a colony. Colonial, it was called. Just a few months after their arrival, after the Spanish troops were attacked by Pohnpeian forces from Net and Sokehs, the Spaniards walled in the colony. A fort was erected to defend the colony, and sentries were posted at the gates to screen all those entering.
The stone walls were laid by hand using lime mortar and were filled with small holes through which rifles could be fired. These walls were so striking that a British soldier nicknamed the colony the White-Walled City during a recent visit here. A Spanish report, 1899.
The Spanish made a few early attempts to build roads to other parts of the island, but they were discontinued because of local opposition. There were no ambitious public works projects, no development projects. For all practical purposes, the Spanish governor and his team remained confined to Colonia. They were little more than prisoners in their own colony. With the Spanish came Catholic missionaries. The Marianas had been evangelized 200 years earlier. Now Catholic priests and brothers were brought into the Carolines, Palau, Yap, Chuk, and Pohnpei. There they would work alongside, or sometimes in opposition to, Protestant pastors. Like the Protestant Church, which had arrived nearly half a century earlier, the Catholic Church would become an enduring force in the islands. In early October 1899, a German naval cruiser arrived at Pohnpei to raise a German flag over the island. Spain had just suffered defeat in the Spanish-American War and was forced to abandon its remaining Pacific possessions. As the U.S. took formal possession of Guam, Germany purchased from Spain the Carolines and Marianas. First on Pohnpei, then on Yap and Saipan, the Spanish colors were solemnly lowered as troops stood at attention. The German flag was then raised as new German officials watched. The Carolines and Marianas, like the Marshalls before them, would now be under German rule.
The Germans never had more than 350 colonials here at one time in all Micronesia. They really didn't have many, but they were closer to the Micronesians than the Spanish were. I think that's a very fair statement to make. They wanted the upper class, upper-ranked, higher-ranked Micronesians to be their representatives in the villages and throughout Micronesia.
Within a few years, Yappies had replaced all the Melanesian policemen the Germans had brought with them. Outer Islanders were also given a place on the police force. Soon there was a squad of 33 policemen on Yap alone.
In the German days, they talked about them as Soldau, meaning soldiers. That's how they referred to them. And they were very highly selective in choosing the people to be on that force.
This is Gillifus, one of the first Yappies chosen to serve as a policeman under the Germans. Like many others on the force, Gillifus was from a high-ranking village, the son of a chief. In all the other district centers, the German administration recruited local policemen from among the chiefly families. These men were to be more than just law enforcement officers. They were to be trained in the language and law of the foreign government. so that they could be brokers for the government and the vanguard of its modernization program. So besides their military drills and rifle practice, they received instruction in the German language, mathematics, and vocational skills. Micronesian policemen spent several hours a day in the classroom, the closest thing to formal schooling offered by the German colonial government. The district officer for Saipan was Georg Fritz. He had a staff of only 2 Germans, a clerk, and a medical aide. In one of the first reports from Saipan, one of his staff wrote,
"The population of Saipan is listed as 1,600, but the population seems to be growing rapidly since there are so many children and Chamorros are constantly arriving from Guam. The population is divided almost equally, with half being Chamorros, on the other half Carolines. There are no government buildings on Saipan, for this was not a seat of government before the Spanish-American War.
One of the first projects of the new administration was to build a government administration building. The imposing new structure was surrounded by a wide terrace supported by latte stone pillars, representing the traditional Chamorro culture. But there was another unusual feature of the administrative building: the large clock mounted on the dome. Fritz may have paid his respect to the past in this architectural monument, but he was also suggesting the new order that would prevail under the German government. Punctuality, along with neatness, would be emphasized by the new overlords in Micronesia. The Germans soon introduced an ambitious public works program in their new colonies. Nowhere, however, was this program more ambitious and more splendidly successful than in Yap. The German administrator, von Benningsen, writes,
When we returned to Yap in November 1899, we found that the district officer Arno Senft had already called a meeting of all the chiefs in the island. In the course of the meeting, he laid the foundation for an orderly administration.
Well, they would refer to him as Amman Senft, and he was like the German administrator who had his office here in Colonial.
Senft took his post and wasted no time implementing the German works program. He quickly began recruiting laborers for work projects. Recruitment of the laborers was easy. Senft simply told the chiefs how many men were needed for a project. The chiefs, working closely with Yapese policemen from their area, assigned the manpower for the project.
The chiefs talked with the German administrators. Through the chiefs, they got all the villagers to agree to provide this source of labor.
Laggards were reported by the policemen to their chiefs, who used customary sanctions to get them to work. It was an effective system, depending as it did on the close collaboration between the foreign government and traditional chiefs. By 1902, the results of the new work program were quite visible. There were paved roads running the length of the island, along with 5 cross-island roads.
The Germans started opening up roads to other parts of Yap. The main road going to the south, there were no cars, so I don't know what went through there. I heard that there were horses used by the German administrators and their staff.
Bridges of sawed lumber spanned all major streams, and shade trees were planted along the roadside. Senft could boast that no other island in the South Seas has proportionally as many and as good roads as Yap. A stone pier 400 yards long, built by Yapese under German supervision, allowed even the largest steamers to pull alongside the shore at low tide. But the greatest accomplishment was the completion of the Tagaren Canal, a channel 20 feet wide and over a half-mile long through the northern part of the main island. The canal provided a waterway from the port to the northernmost islands of Map and Ramung. The project took 350 Yapese 8 months to complete.
The chief from Tamil and Map and Rumung and those people, they work on that. They have a party for it at that time when they finish. They collect some Yapese food, they drink tuba.
Then, in 1905, an undersea cable was laid, connecting Yap with Celebes, Guam, and Shanghai. With a new cable station, Yap became the western anchor in a communications network that bound together the Western Pacific and Asia. The European population grew. New houses were built, and a spacious club and restaurant were erected. A new government office building was constructed. 2 new hospitals were put up, one for the growing foreign community and another for Yapese. To make room for all this construction, the Chamorros and Filipinos who once lived in the small settlement were relocated around the inlet that came to be known as Chamorro Bay. For the Germans, Yap had been a model colony. For Yapese, another definitive step had been taken toward accommodation with the Western world. At the turn of a century, Palauans were still going around in loincloths and grass skirts, their bodies smeared with turmeric. A century of intermittent contact with the British had left the people curiously unchanged. Palauans had been quick to recognize the advantage of European firearms, but there had been little change in the way people dressed and how they worked and what they ate. German influence in Palau began in 1905, when Senft sent his police chief, Winkler, to open a branch station there.
Herr Winkler, most of the Palauans talk of him as being very strict, and you, I guess, would expect that of a German bureaucrat.
Tamleungil esel tulo sa imbring latingil mlemring latingil lolis aklo sa molal malius morula aureur emelaya atupkap kra temelarak tra lius mabu.
After their successes in Yap, the Germans were disappointed to find that the Palauans failed to meet their quotas for planting young coconut trees, and they had done no work on the public projects they were expected to complete. The men spent their days lounging in the clubhouses that were so central to Palauan village life. The clubhouses, or bais, were served by young women abducted from other villages who waited on the men and provided sexual services for them. Winkler's first campaign, then, was against the clubhouses. He decreed that no able-bodied man was to spend daylight hours in the clubhouse and called on his policemen to enforce this rule.
It's my understanding that the Germans were able to stamp out inter-village warfare as well as institutionalized concubinage.
Within a year, Winkler succeeded in suppressing clubhouse prostitution, which the Germans believed was responsible for the rampant venereal disease and decreased fertility that was leading to a serious decline in the population. In this campaign, Winkler found strong support from many of the island chiefs. They saw this as an opportunity to undercut the rival power of the clubhouses once and for all. The success of this first German initiative sparked other reforms. People were forbidden to give out children for adoption. Divorce laws were tightened. Work schedules were imposed for clearing land for planting. When some of the villages refused to comply, the German administration blamed the spirit mediums for launching a protest movement. The spirit mediums were men or women who spoke for the patron spirits of a village. Perched on the second floor of their high shrines, they were consulted for auguries on all important occasions, and were richly rewarded for their services. Although they stood outside the usual ranking system, these mediums often had a huge influence in local affairs. Their private wealth, powerful influence, and independent status made them formidable rivals of the Palauan chiefs. The spirit mediums continued to mount resistance to the German program of modernization. They invited the chiefs of Koror and Melekeok to join in an uprising to free Palau of its foreign rulers. When the chiefs reported the plot to the German authorities, Winkler marched with his small police force to Ngaralong at the northern tip of Bebeldaup to arrest the ringleaders in the plot to dislodge the Germans. Winkler burned down a new shrine that had been built against express German orders and took 6 spirit mediums into custody. The men were sent to Yap and later to Saipan, where they remained in exile for years. In all this, Winkler had the support of the chiefs, who were more than willing to help suppress the power of their rivals. The most influential figure among the Palauan chiefs, and the strongest ally in the modernization program, was a man by the name of Lo. One German described him as an imposing figure with his tall, muscular frame, his expressive face, his flowing white beard, and his bushy eyebrows. Europeans thought that he looked like Neptune, or an old Nordic sea hero. Lo had worked on a ship as a young man and was fluent in English. He had a mastery of seamanship and navigation that was unsurpassed on the island, and his years abroad had given him an appreciation of European ways. At Winkler's arrival, Lo held the second highest title in Koror and was one of the most respected men in Palau. Within a few years, he would become Ibidul, the High Chief of Koror. More than anyone else, Lo was to be the guiding spirit of reform, the prophet of the New Age. The celebration of the German Emperor's birthday in 1908 was special in Palau. Spirits were high among the chiefs and German administration because of their recent triumphs.
On the big day, mountains of cooked taro and fish and pork stood in each house in Koror. Station Commander Winkler appeared with his local police troop. As the school ceremony began, all the island chiefs appeared together. The young students sang and gave speeches in German, showing what they had learned even in the 2 years since the school opened. Who will win on Kaiser's Day is the question everyone was asking. Raimund Leil, Capuchin priest, 1908.
Hundreds of people, far more than in previous years, attended. Many of the women now wore simple dresses, while the men had their hair cut shorter. They watched athletic events, canoe races, and dance competitions. the kind of contests that would confer status in the new era. All the while, Lo, now the most powerful man in Palau, surveyed the scene with satisfaction. At the same time, a strong reaction to modernization and the outside forces that brought it was also developing in Palau. Within the next 10 years, under the leadership of Temadad and others, it would flower into a reactionary religious movement known as Micronesia.
Micronesia means to bring them together, meaning the spirits of Palau with the people. And Temadad was the leader early on. Generally speaking, the Palauan remembrances of Temadad in his times are positive, and that he was a great leader. The colonial remembrances of Temadad are more checkered than that.
Things were going well for the Germans in Palau. All the government needed now was an industry, a source of commercial profits. That was provided by phosphate, a mineral used in fertilizers, which was discovered on the island of Angaur. In 1909, mining operations began there. Chinese were brought in to provide labor at first, but within a year, Germans began recruiting islanders for the work. Soon 300 young men from Palau, Yap, and the atolls of the Central Carolines were living on Angaur. Housed in long wooden barracks, the men worked 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, to earn the equivalent of $4 a month. They dug out the phosphate and loaded it on handcars that carried it by rail to the dockside for loading onto German freighters.
Mogol na yak of no nga or ko sin na bari no oror was okarar wakanon o anan was hichero pipik salat taya payo po misina makoros mako dago gadangai.
In the evenings, they entertained themselves singing and dancing, thus passing on the stick dances, marching dances, and songs and chants that are so widespread today throughout the region. Even by the end of German rule, Palau did not have the roads or bridges that Yap had. But Palau experienced a thrust towards modernization far greater than ever before in its history. In 10 years' time, the island group that had been a backwater in the region was catapulted into the 20th century. Palau was not the only place that was being transformed under German rule. Chuk, notorious for its incessant warfare, was an early target of German reforms. Barely a year after German acquisition of the islands, the governor made a surprise visit to Chuuk on a naval cruiser. He expelled several traders for selling contraband liquor and firearms to the people. Then he and his police force arrested 3 chiefs who were implicated in recent murders. One of them was Ngeramun from Uman. The chiefs were taken aboard the naval cruiser to Pohnpei and imprisoned for 2 years. When German authorities returned to Chuuk 3 years later, they demanded that people turn in all their guns. The people complied without the slightest resistance, surrendering a total of 436 rifles and 2,500 rounds of ammunition. It was as if the people of Chuuk, notoriously divided and constantly at war with one another, were just waiting for a show of leadership strong enough to compel their submission. The German governor appointed 6 flag chiefs, one over every major island in Chuuk Lagoon. With this, inter-village warfare in Chuuk ended at last. Meanwhile, traders continued to do good business in Chuuk. The Hartmans, Naruns, Irons, and Nedeliks, along with the Moris and Shirais, gathered now and then to celebrate their good fortune. In a new era of peace, their trade was thriving and their families were growing. As long as the beer and liquor they imported was used for their own parties, German authorities were satisfied. Change was in the air. But this change gave rise to nativistic revivalism at times, as it did in Palau. In Chuuk, the revivalism centered on the old dances, but included a return to traditional dress, the use of turmeric, and a reversion to contact with the dead through spirit mediums. For several years, this revival movement spread throughout the Mortlocks and the atolls to the west of Chuuk. But even the way the old dances were performed underscored the power of this change. The German anthropologist Augustin Kramer noticed something strange about the dances he watched at the celebration of the emperor's birthday. They were performed with hesitancy, he wrote, as if they were no longer rooted in the life of the people. Pacific Islanders have always had to contend with natural disasters. But some of the most severe typhoons in recorded history struck the region during this period. In April 1905, a major typhoon ravaged Pohnpei, wiping out so much of the housing and crops that people found it easier to report what was left standing than what was destroyed. A German administrator reported,
In a few hours, the violent typhoon transformed the luxuriant island into a desolate field of debris. The event was so fast and the destruction so complete that it was like a bad dream. The colony was razed nearly to the ground, except for a few jutting remains and the strong walls surrounding it. The economic prospects of Pohnpei seem desperate. Trade is destroyed for years. German report, Deutsches Kolonialblatt, 1905.
The German government, seeing this as an opportunity to advance their disarmament program, offered Pohnpeians canned meat and rice in exchange for their rifles and shells. Hundreds of starving people from the surrounding atolls of Pingelap and Mokiel were relocated on Pohnpei. That same year, another massive typhoon struck Jaluit, wiping out many of the trading firms' buildings and leaving the island in ruins. Then, in 1907, an even stronger typhoon hit the Mortlock Islands. Huge waves broke over the tiny island of Ta, sweeping away 200 people. Within a few months, German ships evacuated nearly 1,500 destitute Mortlockese, resettling them on Saipan and Chuuk. 2 years later, many of the Mortlockese were relocated on Pohnpei, where they were given land and food in return for their labor. They were the nucleus of the first Mortlockese community there, a community that would expand in years to come. Just weeks later, in 1907, the same typhoon ravaged Wolai and other outliers of Yap. As the typhoon winds howled and giant waves washed over the island, people found what refuge they could. A German physician on Wolai at the time described the horror they endured.
There was a house on a little knoll in which a large crowd of screaming and weeping islanders had taken refuge. Some of the women were singing shrill death laments in their distress. If the sea reached this part of the island too, we were lost. Dr. Born, German physician, 1907.
More than 230 people on Wolai were swept away to their death. The islands stricken by the typhoon were stripped of trees, and the people dazed by what they had experienced. More homeless and hungry people. More people to be relocated. The Germans were forced to take many of the islanders to Saipan for resettlement. But these were only the first of many forced relocations to occur under foreign rule. The German administration was engaged in a program of change throughout the islands it ruled. Local people were encouraged to plant coconut trees to increase copra production. Hospitals were built, and doctors were brought in to improve health conditions. New roads and docks were constructed. The Germans even established a rudimentary school system in one or two places. Yet a team of German anthropologists, members of the Hamburg South Seas expedition, who studied the area between 1908 and 1910, painstakingly recorded details of the traditional island cultures and practices. Their work, which covered everything from weaving and warfare to folk tales and religious belief, offered one last glimpse of island life as it existed in the beginning of the 20th century. Chuk, ornamentation, including coconut shell earrings. Frigate bird feather and comb. The nose flute, the only traditional musical instrument. Then the world of spirits. This double-hulled boat hanging from a canoe house that was believed to transport spirits from the world beyond to their kin. The Tapuanu masks from the Mortlocks, used to call the spirits to increase the breadfruit harvest. A shrine built to honor the spirit of a renowned navigator from the island of Punlap. A specialist performing purification rituals on Lamatrek. Yap, priests serving one of the agricultural deities, sit in front of the sacred shrine at Teb. There was even a time when men wove mats in Yap. The mats that were used as a medium of exchange in the old days and displayed from the rafters of the clubhouse. Through long interviews with old informants, like Solikin Chokola and Nanawa and Dolakap on Pohnpei, and Telengkun on Koshrai, the anthropological team was able to peel away layers of change to uncover some of the cultural features that had already fallen into disuse. Long before dresses and pants came into fashion, Koshraians dressed like this, the Germans were told. Even sakao was once an important part of Koshraian culture, as this old pounding rock suggests. In the detailed writings on the island cultures, the Germans established the first solid anthropological studies of the area. This would become the foundation on which future ethnography in Micronesia would rest. German policy in the islands was changing. The colonial administration was impatient with the slow pace of development, especially in the Eastern Carolines. In 1908, Georg Fritz, the newly appointed governor of Pohnpei, limited the number of chiefly feasts and imposed a tax on all Pohnpeian males to be paid in labor.
Pohnpeians had their way of contributing or giving to the chiefs certain produce of their land in return for apparently staying in the land, because the chiefs were in control of that. Now that is changed during the German period, and they said, okay, we would like to tax all of the males of Pohnpei, and you will be doing taxation in terms of public projects.
Governor Karl Böder, who replaced Fritz in 1910, was ordered to enforce this labor tax. Like the Spaniards before them, the Germans began a road-building project using Pohnpeian labor.
The Spanish, before the Germans, were not imposing too much of themselves on the Pohnpeians, although they required some work. So my thinking is that the manner in which the German people treated both the common people and the leadership were not appropriate to the Pohnpeians.
Feelings among Sokehs people ran high when they were put to work building a road around their own island as part of the labor tax. Troops from New Guinea were brought in to reinforce the local police force.
The other thing that I think was boiling or was happening underneath all of these is the land tenure system was being changed from an older system which placed the ownership of land with the non-marquis, and the ownership was taken away from them and placed in the private ownership realm.
Hostilities spilled over into violence after one of the governor's staff manhandled the highest-ranking chief of Sokehs, and the German construction foreman flogged one of the local workers. For the people of Sokehs, this was the last straw. The traditional leaders gathered the people for a feast and announced to them their plan to rebel against the German government.
Well, during the feast, Somatao and Sokehs indicated to the people of Sokehs that the following day there will be no work on the construction of the road. But there was an understanding that they will be ready to fight. And so when the German project manager got there in the morning, there was nobody at the work site, not a single soul. So he started ringing a bell to call them in. When the people showed up, they showed up well anointed. Their bodies were well anointed, and they wore grass skirts. And they carried machetes that were not normally used for that kind of work. And so just looking at them gave the German project manager the idea that they were going to do something that day.
The project managers hid themselves in a German church and attempted to send a letter to the governor warning of a possible attack. But the leaders of the rebellion intercepted this message.
So on the same day, through some other means, the governor learned of what was happening. So he took a number of soldiers, I think, and head on down to Sokehs. He wanted to see the people who were congregating there. But before he could get there, he was jumped on the road. And actually, it was not the Somatao and Sokehs who killed him. It was his brother, younger brother. His name was Liberer, and he jumped out and shot the governor.
Also killed was a project manager. The rebellion had begun. The handful of Germans on the island fled to the colony, where the wall was hastily rebuilt and new defenses set up. The Germans summoned help from other parts of the island. Net, U, and Medellin responded immediately. Kitchi sent forces a few days later. The task of guarding the colony fell to these allies of the Germans. By early January 1911, 5 German warships had anchored off Pohnpei. The ships, which brought additional troops and artillery, cordoned off Sokehs Island. The column of German troops, combined with Melanesian policemen, soon advanced towards Sokehs to attack the Sokehs warriors. For an hour before the assault, guns on the German warships pounded the defenders' position on top of Sokehs Ridge. Led by Pohnpeian guides, the German troops scaled the heights of Sokehs. The fortified position that the Sokehs men held at the top of the ridge was abandoned when the German force reached the summit. The people had slipped past the climbing Germans and escaped to other parts of the island.
I don't think that there was any one time that there was a face-to-face shootout of the rebels and the soldiers. I think the people of Pohnpei at that time were fighting the first guerrilla warfare. That is, they would come out, shoot some people, and then disappear into the woods.
During the next several days, the German troops scoured Palikir and the rest of Sokehs for defenders. By the end of their sweep, they rounded up 250 Sokehs people, a little more than half the total population.
Those people who were members of the Punpanmai group were the ones who persisted. They wanted to carry on. They know they cannot win. So what happened was that they were trying to recruit people who will fight with them by visiting all of the members of their clan around Pohnpei. But I think the event occurred so quickly that it didn't take enough time for Somadao and Sokehs to get the loyalty of the people of Pohnpei, even with his clans, because he couldn't move fast enough from one place to another to really gather the good support.
With the German troops doggedly pursuing them around the island, Pohnpeian warriors began surrendering. The Sokehs warriors had avenged themselves and no longer had the heart for battle. Chief Samuel, one of the main leaders of the Sokehs party, was captured by the Germans. A few days later, the last of the fugitives turned themselves in.
Somadao and Sokehs at that time said, okay, we are going to give ourselves in. But his younger brother didn't want to do that. The younger brother asked them one more time, let's go and fight until the last of us passed away, died. Let's just go and fight. And the older brother told him no, they were not going to fight.
After a summary trial, the Germans sentenced 17 men, including Leperren and Somatau, to be executed by firing squad.
I think there is a large hole that was dug, and they put up stakes or woods where they will be tied to and then shot. So this young man walked in there, looked down, and he said, you know, there is a lot of water in our grave. So, I mean, just by observation that there is water in there at the time of your execution is something that indicates to the Pohnpeians that this guy, you know, he accepts his fate with comfort and with good spirits.
German transports carried off to exile the remainder of the Sokehs people, about 460 in all. The empty land in Sokehs was soon settled by relocated outer islanders. The exiles were brought to Yap for a few months and then to Palau, which was to become their home. There they lived in Imalik until the end of German rule, just 3 years later. It was October 1914. A squadron of warships steamed into Micronesia. One task force headed for Yap and Palau, and another to the islands in the east. At each of the major islands, the warships sent ashore launches filled with Marines. From the stern of these launches flew the red sunburst of the Japanese Navy.
Now, the British and the Japanese had memos of understanding which called for the Japanese to help them protect their colonies of Singapore and Hong Kong in the event of war. On the strength of these memos, the Japanese come into Micronesia in October 1914, and they take over everything.
As startled islanders watched, military officers posted the official proclamation of Japanese rule over the islands.
There was a formation, and the Japanese were wearing these white uniforms, and the Germans had these dark blue woolen uniforms, and the German handed over his sword to the Japanese, and then they passed out rice cakes to everybody. All the little kids got candies.
With the outbreak of the First World War, Japan was seizing Germany's island possessions. For Micronesians, it was another change in colonial rule. Japan's first thrust into the South Seas had been made over 20 years earlier. Japanese trading companies, in search of new markets, established a presence in the Carolines in the early 1890s. Koben Mori, son of a samurai, settled in Chuuk, where he would found a prominent family and live out the rest of his life. Magahira Shirai, who fought in the wars of the Meiji Restoration, also arrived in Chuuk at this time. By the end of 1914, there were dozens of Japanese traders throughout the islands, and much more island produce was being shipped to Japan than to Europe. Even before its acquisition of Micronesia, Japan had acquired the major share of island trade. Once again, merchants had prepared the way for the colonizers. Japanese naval officers took over the administration of the islands. In doing so, they continued features of the system they inherited from the Germans. They retained the flag chiefs that had been installed by the predecessors, and continued to collect a yearly land tax. They also introduced new public services. Jaluit, the capital of the Marshals, soon had a Japanese-run hospital. The Corps of Naval Doctors, assisted by local health aides, conducted a medical survey of the Marshals and soon began visiting other atolls to treat patients. The Japanese also began a rudimentary public school system, the first ever in Micronesia. Only the main island in each group had a school, but it was the beginning of a more widespread education system. Marshallese students took classes in Japanese language, with a little arithmetic and singing added. Everywhere there were athletic contests and field days. Japanese influence was limited at first. But this was just a little foretaste of what was yet to come.
Guru